Another example which exhibits how many slaves they had in their employ is the Adaidin Ka Jhopra, which is it's in Ajmer, and it was a group of 3 or 4 temples. And when Gauri defeated Prithviraj Chauhan, he passed through Ajmer, and he came across this temple complex, and he said, "I want this converted into a mosque in 60 hours." And he told his slave general Ebak, and Ebak took 80,000, 70,000, how many even slave men they had, and he converted the entire thing into a mosque in 60 hours. Can you imagine how many men it took? Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about the history of Islamic slave trade in India. So I'm briefly going to go over the condition of slaves in pre-Islamic India first, just to give an overview of what changed when the institution of Islamic slavery set in. And then we're going to go into obviously the theological justification, all the compendia on Islamic law that covers slavery. And then we're going to just briefly touch on the origins of racial prejudice against Hindus in Islamic literature and Persian literature. And then we're going to go into the slave markets in Central Asia, which were the main centers at which Indian slaves were traded. And then we're going to go into I'm not doing this in chronological order, but I'll just go over history and like major conquests that led to the enslavement of a large number of Indians. And then I'll go into some just a small note on Portuguese slavery and some of the and then some of the rulers after that, the conquests after that. Then a note on foreign and indigenous slaves, how they were treated, the differences in treatment in India, and then the prices of slaves, which we don't have much information on, but I did collect what is available. Then we'll go into all the avenues in which slaves were employed in not just medieval India, but also in Central Asia. So, for example, like in construction, most of the Islamic architecture, and then their employment is in the court, in the royal courts, and in nobilities' families as domestic labor. And then we'll go into sex slavery and concubinage, and then we'll go into the trade of eunuchs, which is a fairly large topic, but I tried to get some of the most pertinent information just for this talk, and you can read more if you'd like on that. And then slaves in the armies, we'll go into that. And then briefly, like, what were the historical conditions that led to decline of slavery in India. And then we'll go into the impact of slavery on the landscape in India. Like a lot of things that are attributed to British colonialism, who were, you could say they were the successors of the Mughal state. A lot of factors in Indian society that are attributed to British colonialism can also have arisen due to the Islamic imperialism. So we'll go into that very briefly. It's quite a long talk, so I'll get into it really quickly. So in pre-Islamic India, basically, when Megasthenes visited India, he said the Indians have no slaves and they don't even enslave foreigners. But obviously, this was quite erroneous, and there were slaves, but it's just that he couldn't perceive the presence of slaves just because they were treated so well, or they weren't, treated as badly as elsewhere in the world at the time, because Greeks, Romans, the Islamic empires, everyone had slaves at the time. He thought there were no slaves in India, but they were there. I'll go into what the Arthashastra dictates for the treatment of slaves and all the rules, the laws regarding that. And so as I said, they were treated. Of course, there must have been abuse. I'm not going to say that there was no slave abuse in pre-Islamic India, but it was punishable by law. So that's important. So I'll just, the Manusmriti lays down human rights for slaves. It's not, they're not dehumanized. They're not treated as badly as in the Islamic institution. So briefly, what the Arthashastra says about slavery. This slide looks like a lot, but I'll just quickly read out the most pertinent information. It may be a little small also for you guys to read. Basically, the enslavement of any human being, any free person, is punishable by a fine, and the fine is incremental according to the caste of the person who's involved. So, fine of 12 panas, and for a Vaishya it's 24, for a Kshatriya it's 36, and for a Brahmana it's 48. So, it is a crime to sell people who were not slaves. And then, look at this. If any person steals an animal or abducts a male or female slave, they should have both their legs cut off or pay a fine of 600 panas. And then one of the major differences between the Islamic institution of slavery and what we saw in pre-Islamic India was the treatment of female slaves. The female slaves were not for sex slavery; they could not be purchased for that purpose. And in case a man defiles the daughter of his own male or female slave, he shall pay a fine, but also provide the maiden with an adequate nuptial fee and jewelry. And if he raped his female slave, he would have to set the slave free. So look at this. When a child is begotten by a female slave, both the child and the mother shall be recognized as free. And there's a major difference, because in Islam, as you'll see in the next slide, in Islam, the purpose of slavery and concubinage is the production of children and sex and domestic labor. So that's a huge difference between how slaves were treated in both. I'll just go to the next slide because you guys can read this later. So yeah, these are the pertinent Quranic verses about slaves, sex slavery, distribution of slaves, enslavement of infidels. Obviously, it's kosher to enslave infidels. All their property becomes yours. All their plunder is yours. Their women and children become yours. So obviously, it's ordained by Islam, which we know. So Muhammad, by introducing the concept of a religious war against infidels and denying human rights to these captured infidels, he sanctioned slavery on an unprecedented scale. He himself is said to have possessed 59 slaves, and his close companion owned about 1,000. And the interesting thing, an Arab philosopher by the name Ibn Khaldun, he said slavery is a divine providence, and infidels are cured uh, by the by slavery, bringing them into Islam by slavery. So slavery was viewed as a positive thing that brings more infidels into Islam, into the house of Islam. So that's just proof of their dehumanizing uh, view of them. And this slide's kind of unrelated. It's about the Barbary slave trade, but I just wanted to mention it because it's important to put into context the theological justification. And what I mean by this is, it's not just written in a book somewhere, it's put into action, it's policy. So what happens is, the Barbary coast, which is like the entire north of Africa, like Morocco, Algiers, the Horn. So this area, all the Islamic empires there, they pirated the seas for slaves. They took part in the slave trade quite aggressively. And what happened was, I think in the late 1700s, they captured a neutral, peaceful American ship. And they would do this quite often with European ships and American ships. But I think some Europeans had some treaties with them, so they would leave them alone, if they paid them and all that. But when American slaves were captured, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams went to meet the ambassador of Tripoli, and then he said, why'd you capture the neutral, peaceful American sailors? And then the ambassador said, it said in the Quran that I can, like, I'm doing it, like, so I'm just trying to say that it's a matter of policy and not just something related to religion. It enters into politics, it enters into policy, it enters into action. So it's not just written in a book, but it's just not ignored by the most of the followers. That's not the case. Okay, yeah. So the Hidayah, it's basically a compendium on Islamic law, and it was based on the Quran, the Hadith, and the four schools of Islamic jurisprudence. And it basically lays down all the laws for Muslims to subdue infidels and enslave them, take their women and children, etc. And why it's important is because um, this was the document that was used in Islamic empires in India in all their dealings. So whenever they sanctioned conquest, whenever they sanctioned enslavement, it was justified using the Hidayah, and their Islamic scholars would, judges would put these into action basically in the Indian subcontinent. So that's why it's important. It has, everything related to taking captives, making converts, ordering massacres, and basically this rule of law was followed wherever Islamic empires were established. So including not just Indian subcontinent, but even farther in Southeast Asia. And similar to the Hidayah, we had Aurangzeb who came up with the Fatwa-i-Alamgiri. What he did was he he thought the Hidayah wasn't it was fine, but what happened was there were a lot of contradictions within the Hidayah. So what happened was Islamic scholars would debate them, and all these contradictions and arguments would keep coming up. So he wanted to solve this once and for all. And what he did was he hired about 500 experts in Islamic jurisprudence from Medina, Baghdad, and Delhi and Lahore, and paid them like 200,000 rupees, or 2 lakh rupees rather, and then compiled the entire Sharia law into the Fatwa-i-Alamgiri, and quite egregious stuff it has. It obviously fixes it tries to fix the prices of slaves, but they're also variable according to the ruler and the local, conditions. But it basically has all the Islamic laws related to slaves, and this book was quite important. Even after the death of Aurangzeb, it became one of the most important documents of Islamic civil law in India. And it has stuff like a Muslim man's right to have sex with a captive slave girl, and then he can have sex with another man's slave girl if he has his permission. And then the inability of infidels and slaves to inherit property. And there's another big difference in Islamic slave trade as slavery as it existed, and pre-Islamic India, who had slaves but they could inherit property, they could purchase land. Their property did not revert automatically to the master. They could have children without the permission of the master, and the children inherited their wealth. And also they could also purchase their own freedom. So in the Arthashastra it says that if you pay the same amount that that was paid for you, you can purchase your own freedom from your master. So that's another thing. Obviously in Islam the rules for manumission are many. I'm not going to get into that much. So yeah, if a purchased female slave has too large breasts or too loose or wide a vagina, the purchaser has the right to return her for a refund. So all of this, it protected the rights of the master and not the slave. If a master beat the slave within an inch of death, he was still refundable. So that's what it was. And just to put into context the Fatwa-i-Alamgiri and the importance it had, I'm not going to spend much time on this slide. I think I'm basically when the power shifted to the British, they used the fatwa. They actually translated the Fatwa-i-Alamgiri, three or four, like including Neil Bail as I've given here, and a few more Britishers who knew Persian and Arabic. They translated the Fatwa-i-Alamgiri and used it to formulate laws for the Muslims in India, and also for as personal law, and also to craft some common law for everyone. So it's quite an important document. I highly recommend reading. the reinvention of Sharia under the British Raj. It's a paper. I'll like post a link later. It's really interesting how these laws were incorporated into Indian law. And then yeah, so the origins of racial prejudice in Islam. So there's something called the curse of Ham, and the curse of Ham is from the Old Testament. It's given here, where basically he looks upon Noah, and looks upon is kind of a dirty thing in the Bible. So he looks upon Noah, you know, weirdly. So not weirdly, but like he looks upon him, with a glint in his eye, so to speak. And then he gets cursed to eternal slavery. And then Canaan and Ham both eventually in both biblical and Islamic literature, this becomes the basis for enslaving any dark-skinned peoples. So Ham was said to be dark. Canaan is said to have been black, and blackness and slavery went together, were associated. And Ibn Ezra also uses this same word for Hindus, Banuham, which is like dark skin. That's what it meant then. It might have been a misinterpretation of Hebrew, but for all practical purposes, that's what it meant. And even in early Christian work, names Hindus as Indians, as dark skinned people um, who became slaves and who were, cursed to eternal slavery. And so, gradually the curse evolved into um, all those whose skin was black were meant to be enslaved. And blacks and Indians. This mainly covered blacks and Indians. And what happened was in both Roman, Greek, and Jewish and Christian and Islamic literature, there was a confusion between Ethiopians and Indians. So Ethiopians, they used to be confused with each other because they were both dark skinned. And they're all described as coarse, ugly, low. Bernard Lewis wrote a book about this race and slavery in the Middle East, and he quotes many Muslim accounts, which calls black-skinned Indians and Africans as ugly, stupid, dishonest, frivolous, foul-smelling, and black women with the same epithets. So there was quite a dependence on this curse for the justification of slavery, and as slavery increased in the Islamic world, the dependence on this curse increased also. So that's an important thing. And Rumi, as we see in Rumi's work, in Persian works, not just Rumi but other Persian writers as well, would frequently use the word, describe Hindus as dark and meant to be slaves. And in his Masnavi, he writes, is he a Hindu? Then throw him from the roof. And he also says, infidel Hindu India is an ascendant of India's Saturn himself. So Hindus in Persian literature are always regarded as ugly, black, and evil, who like unclean black dogs who are supposed to be enslaved. Yeah. So now we're getting into the meat, so to speak. So the markets in Central Asia, while they dealt with all races of slaves, Indian slaves especially began entering these markets with the first Arab invasions of India, the Islamic conquest of India. And as the conquests increased in number, frequency, and scale, more and more Indians flooded the slave markets abroad. So the greatest factors contributing to the increased supply of Indian slaves were military conquest and tax revenue policies of Muslim rulers in the subcontinent. So, as you know, the tax policies were extremely exacting and unfair, and Hindu peasants were taxed so heavily that they would often sell their own women and children, or even enter into slavery willingly just to pay off their debts. So, that's one of the major reasons for the numbers of Indian slaves that entered the markets, and they were also in demand because Indians were quite skilled in all kinds of labor, not just construction, but agriculture, pastoralists, textile, brick making. They had quite a few skills, and because of their skills, they were quite in demand in uh, Central Asian markets, and also as sex slaves. So and many of these artisans and those skilled in labor and construction, they were all employed in building Central Asian architecture. So maybe you look upon Central Asian medieval architecture differently if you know that a Hindu slave or a Hindu artisan worked on it. They were also employed in soldiering, maintaining irrigation canals, textiles, pottery, carpentry. So everything that India had going, all the industries that India had going, all the factories, they employed slaves for those purposes because Indians were skilled. And also, affluent households in Central Asia owned quite a few slaves. So, gardeners, pastoralists, agricultural labor, domestic labor, there were just teeming with slaves. So, yeah, just before I get into the history, I just want to talk about the Hindu Kush, which used to be called Abyssian in Persian. But the term Hindu Kush was introduced, I think, around 1000 AD. The first known use is on a map in 1000 AD. And Hindu Kush, as you know, means Hindu slayer, and because as they were, as Hindu slaves were tied up and taken across the Hindu Kush mountains in Afghanistan, the harsh climatic conditions would kill off quite a few of them. So it was called the Hindu slayer, and Ibn Battuta attests to this in his travels, a book of travels. And the mortality rate for transporting slaves across the subcontinent is quite high. So when we see say 50,000 or 100,000 slaves reaching the markets abroad, you know that they started with 20 or 30% more, because there's the mortality rate is high. Some of them would fall behind and would be killed. I even read an account that took place somewhere in Egypt, where if a group of slaves were being led along and some of them fell behind, they would just be killed or hung from the nearest tree, and not just killed, but they would make the other slaves carry that head, because the dude doesn't want to be accused of killing off some of the slaves or selling them by the master. So he gets the heads back to the master just to make sure the count is correct. So that the horrific treatment can't be forgotten when we talk about this sort of thing. So I'll just briefly go over the history a little bit, starting from the Arab invasion of Sindh. So Qasim was essentially the first proper successful Islamic conquest of India, and he entered India in 712, and he first attacked Deval near Karachi, and that fort was garrisoned by about 4,000 Kshatriya soldiers and 3,000 Brahmanas, and all males above the age of 17 and up were put to the sword, and their women and children were enslaved. 700 beautiful females who had taken shelter in the nearby temple were all captured along with their valuable ornaments, clothes adorned with jewels, and they were obviously sold into sex slavery. So Qasim dispatched one-fifth of the legal spoil to Hajjaj, who was the governor of the Umayyad Caliphate at the time. And he did this in whichever city he attacked. So if you look at the city names, like I didn't some of the information isn't even available of how many people he took, but all we know is that in about 3 years he's said to have taken approximately 300,000 infidels back to Central Asia. So the plunder and loot, as we know, he attacked India quite a few times, and the plunder and loot just unimaginable. And enslavement, I'm focusing on enslavement and not destruction of temples and all that. So just unimaginable scale of destruction. And when he attacked Revar, he massacred 6,000 men and enslaved 60,000 of their dependents, including their women and children. And of these, 30 young ladies were of royal blood, and he sent them all to Hajjaj. So this is just a picture of a mosque in Multan. And why I chose this is because before Multan was attacked, it was a huge center of Surya worship in ancient India, especially in the 6th century onward. And when Hayan Sang came to Multan in 641, he reported, and Multan is named after Moolasthana, which is a centrally located Aditya temple in the middle of the city. And so when Huan Sang came, he described the Surya idol there inside the temple, which was made of solid gold, and his eyes were of rubies. So just the grandeur and the wealth was unimaginable in ancient India. Ghazni, yeah. So we know Ghazni attacked. Ghazni attacked India about 17 times, and each time he would obviously take as many slaves as he could. And in the year 1000 to 1002, he said to have taken 500,000 people captive of both sexes. And these were all, and Ghazni is especially well recorded because he had a personal chronicler who was Al Utbi, and Utbi, people say Utbi's numbers are exaggerating, but I mean exaggerated. But even if you, of 500,000, even if you take half, that's still a huge number of people that are enslaved by him. He sold most of them in Central Asian markets, and as you can imagine, Central Asian markets, Turkey, Uzbek, all these markets swelled with Indian slaves, and as I said, they were also in demand, so the prices went down, which I'll get into later. So again, taking slaves was a matter of routine in every expedition, and only when the numbers were exceptionally large did they receive the notice of the chroniclers. So numbers that are available speak for themselves. Yeah. So you have to project these numbers a little bit into his other invasions, and just to talk about another one of his conquests. So when he attacked Kannauj, he apparently returned with 53,000 captives, and each of these, the prices dipped of Indian slaves so low that they were sold for as little as 2 to 10 dirhams, and uh, this was attested to by Utbi. And as he says, the markets of Iraq and Khorasan were filled with them, and the prices went down. Okay, and then yeah, I just want to touch about King Jaipal really quick because it's interesting, and also I don't want you guys to think that there was no resistance ever to these invaders. And also, yeah, just to before I get into this, I just want to cover. You may be wondering, how is it possible to enslave that many men and kill them and enslave them so easily? Weren't they armed? Weren't they fighting? Yes, they were. They had certain techniques to enslave in large numbers, and basically, and they were highly specialized Islamic soldiers. So suppose you take Ghazni, he had warriors, about 6,000 warriors with him, 6,000 or 5,000 men, if I'm not wrong, and they were all specialized in rounding up slaves and just plundering regions. So what they would do is, when they approached a certain region, they would first put to death all the armed men. So they would round them up and circle them on their horses or whatever, and they would tie them up first and just put them to death. And then what happens is, whoever's watching is just terrorized. So when it comes their turn, they don't really react or try to fight back because they don't want to be put to death. So in that respect, they were they submitted very easily, because just the terrorization of the human psyche, their spirit was broken. They don't want to be torn away from their children and women, so they many a time they had to submit, if you think about it that way. And in many regions they resisted in fighting these people off, and if they couldn't, they all ran away into the jungles, and abandoned their homes and just ran with their children, with their women and children. So it's not that each and every conquest was successful, even though we're talking about the successful ones because that's where the largest number of people were enslaved. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But basically, just to talk about Jaipal really quick, he was the Hindu Shahi king of Afghanistan, his capital at Kabul, and he succeeded in fighting off Ghazni quite a few times, until this one unfortunate time when when there was a snowstorm up in the mountains, uh, and Ghazni, he won, and he took the king and all his relatives and his sons into captivity, and most of the royalty he basically paraded Jaipal around in the markets of Khorasan to be sold like a common slave. And this is the humiliation that nobles were subjected to whenever they were captured, because um, it was quite important to them for the royals who were defeated to be subjected to this sort of humility, and not just royals but even the common men were, obviously, but it was especially the royalty was especially singled out to be subjected to humiliation. So yeah, this is just a picture of the snowstorm from Hutchinson's travels. Just briefly about the Sultanate, I'm not going in chronological order. I'll just go over the major conquests by the sultans. So after the Arab invasions, the Sultanate was when Muslim rule was truly established in India, right? So the same policy of conquest and enslavement, and also taxing and enslavement, was practiced by them. And in fact, and all the sultans owned a large number of slaves. Their palaces were filled with them. Their militaries were filled with them. Their They employed them in building and construction, as I'll get into later. But all of them owned tens of thousands of slaves, harems with 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 women, and eunuchs everywhere to guard these harems. So the scale was just unimaginable. So the slave king Balban, um, he ordered his subordinates to enslave whoever refused to pay tax. So whoever defaulted on their obscene revenues were enslaved, and this contributed quite heavily to the number of people that were enslaved. And also, they took away a substantial portion of their agricultural produce. So all their policies contributed to the increase in the number of slaves. So you have to put these into context of how all these factors are contributing to put pressure, and also their nobles going out and conquering new areas and bringing back slaves. So, like for example, when Aibak, who was the slave of the military general of Ghori, when he invaded Gujarat, 50,000 infidels were dispatched to hell, and from the heaps of this slain, the hills and the plains became one. Okay, fine. More than 20,000 slaves and cattle beyond calculation fell into the hands of victors. So every time these people went out on conquest, they would just enslave in unimaginable numbers. When he attacked Kalinjar, 50,000 men came under the collar of slavery. And in the 13th century, as I said, Balban, who was known as the slave king, he's reported to have defeated a Hindu army in Ranthambore and taken captives beyond computation. And then Bharani says that Khilji owned, I don't know if it's Bharani actually, I'm sorry, Bharani. I mean, excuse my pronunciation in Arabic, I don't know these words, and I've never said them out loud actually. So Khilji owned about 50,000 slave boys and had an additional 70,000 engaged in construction. And in summarizing the feat of slave taking of Ghori and Aibak, it's said that even poor Muslim householders became the owners of numerous slaves, and 3 to 4. Okay, that's not important. Okay, coming to Tughlaq. Tughlaq is one of the sultans who had some of the hugest numbers of slaves that we can even imagine under his employ, and he was also quite successful in using these slaves for like construction and all that. In fact, so he had very efficient techniques of enslaving Hindus. So he commanded his officers to capture slaves whenever they were at war and bring the best of them to the court. A fifth of the slaves were always dispatched to the caliph, as with every Islamic ruler. So slave taking, especially in the case of Tughlaq, wasn't confined to wars. So not just their agricultural policy, which drove peasants to poverty and drove them into slavery, but also he had this unique method of forcefully taking slaves, which I'll get into in the next slide. But basically, Firoz Shah, what did he do with this many slaves? And the answer to that is he undertook some of the most massive construction projects known in Delhi. So although all the sultans did this, so many of the sultans, whenever they ascended the throne, they would build a new city just to make a name for themselves and have their own legacy. So like that, Firoz Shah built Firozabad near Delhi, and it was a huge city. It had mosques, palaces, halls of private and public audience, various utility buildings. And there's a picture of the palace of Firoz, and he just stole the Ashokan pillar and just stuck it on top there. But all the Hindu slaves that he took were employed in construction of all these cities. One second. So this was a system by which Firoz Shah took quite a few slaves. Basically, it was modeled after the Ottoman Empire's.
Sai Priyaji,
Um,
may I just come in for a minute?
yeah, sure, sure.
You may go over the slides even if you want to do it briefly rather than passing them over.
Okay.
Wherever you feel like saying that you can go over it later, and maybe you can just briefly go over it.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Okay. Because I didn't want to take up too much time, but yeah. Okay. I'll spend an extra minute. No problem. So this was the policy. It's called Devshirme, and it was the Ottoman policy of taking Christian boys as slaves um, forcibly from their homes. And basically, they would send an officer out to villages and just randomly choose young boys, generally of age 7, and put them in. Put them into enslavement forcefully, and they would convert them to Islam and train them to fight their own people and train them in various military administration and all of this. And Firoz Shah used the same policy, and he would take 7-year-old boys and young boys from homes, castrate them often, and employ them in his courts and military, and in various roles in his administration. The establishment of domestic slave markets basically happened during the time of the Sultanate. And the distinction between the previous Islamic conquest of India and what happened at the time of the Sultanate was that uh, the slaves, more slaves were kept within the country and sold in domestic markets than sent abroad. So the domestic markets, especially in Delhi, swelled with uh, swelled with Indian slaves. So what happened was, so slave markets mushroomed across India, especially Delhi was a huge center for slaves. And but unlike the markets of the Islamic world, the slaves in Delhi were generally just Indians and not of various ethnicities. One second. So Khusro wrote that the Turks, whenever they pleased, could seize, buy, or sell any Hindu, and they would sell them in these markets for quite low prices. Peasants were carried off to various markets for being sold. And besides Delhi and cities in Bengal, which were main centers for the distribution of eunuchs, there's a mention of Badam in Uttar Pradesh, Mandor in Rajasthan, Kabul, Malabar, all these places being thriving slave markets. And as I said, they didn't generally deal in foreign slaves, because if the ruler, if the sultan or noble or whoever wanted foreign slaves, they weren't from the markets. They were directly from traders who would bring them from Central Asia. So they weren't generally seen in the markets, except in port cities where the Dutch and the Portuguese would buy them and trade them. So that's one big distinction between Central Asian markets and Indian markets. So Portuguese slavery, as you know, this is not related to Islamic slavery in the sense that they're not Muslim, but they were. It's relevant because they were huge customers for Islamic slaves. So not just did they buy a huge number of slaves from the Muslim traders, but also they 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 had a fleet of ships, and they would pirate Islamic ships that were taking slaves abroad. Some accounts say that almost the entirety of Goa was full of slave labor, and the Portuguese never lifted a finger. So, and they also dominated the Indian seas and captured slaves, sold them in the markets of Hooghly, Tamluk, Pipli, Ceylon, Goa, even Chittagong. So they they just freely, like, with no conscience whatsoever. They just freely traded Indian slaves. The Dutch too, but I didn't include this here. So yeah, so the Mughals, obviously the Mughals continued the same policies as the Sultan. They had slave markets, they had slaves, they had everyone in their employ, as I mentioned before. So a major event that sent huge number of Indian slaves to Central Asian markets was Shah Jahan's annexation of Balkh. So what happened was, I'm not going to get into what happened in the event, but basically, before this, if an Indian slave sold in Samarkand for 225 tanga, after this annexation, they sold for as low as 84. So you can imagine the numbers of slaves that entered those markets because of annexations of various Indian cities. So Shah Jahan is said to have beheaded and leaders in enslavement. Whenever there was a rebellion, there were quite a few rebellions, local rebellions against Islamic rulers, and each time they would dispatch the slave armies and the just armies to crush the rebellions, enslave them again, and get their women and children. So every time there was a rebellion, also it contributed to the number of slaves that were in their employ. So yeah, Babarnama even gives an account of carrying slaves to sell for great profits in Kabul and Kandahar. I'm not going into very detailed history because I want to give you guys an overview of what was happening and what was the effect. So when Nadir Shah came, invaded India in 1738, he killed about 200,000 and returned with a huge quantity of booty and number of slaves, including a lot of beautiful young girls. And the plunder was so huge that Nadir Shah stopped taxation in Iran for a period of 3 years following his triumphant return. So you can imagine the amount of wealth that he took from India. Tipu, Tipu the freedom fighter, he in all his conquests, he obviously followed the same Islamic policy of enslavement, conversion, and subjugation of women and children. In fact, when he in the Battle of Travancore, he enslaved and carried away about 7,000 Hindus and Christians to Seringapatam, where they were circumcised, made to eat beef, and forced to convert to Islam. So, and quite a few chroniclers again record Tipu's enslavement of Hindus. Yeah, so just to distinguish between foreign slaves and indigenous slaves, obviously Turkic slaves and quote unquote fair skinned slaves from Central Asia were highly prized, and they in fact weren't sold in Indian markets. As I said, they were directly transported by traders to the rulers as per their requirement. And there was sort of racist attitude that existed. So the indigenous slaves and converts were always seen as inferior, even though they were all slaves, and even though Islam claims that everyone's equal in Islam. They were Indian Muslim slaves were seen as inferior, and in fact, Barani said that was a staunch believer in the racial superiority of the Turks and the baseness of Indian Muslims. He recommended that teachers of every kind be stern and not to thrust precious stones down the throats of dogs. That is to the mean, ignoble, worthless Indian Muslims. So they looked upon them as unworthy of even teaching them Islamic tenets. So um, there was an element of looking down upon Indian indigenous slaves as inferior, and that stems quite a bit from their from the Persian attitudes of racial inferiority. So the prices of slaves. So generally, like I said, the Sharia law fixed prices of slaves, but also it was up to the rulers to kind of regulate the slave market because there were so many. Um, so the combined assault of Ghori and Aibak in the Salt Range yielded so large a number of captives that 5 Hindu captives could be bought for a dinar. So whenever there was a flooding of slaves into the market, as I said, this price would immediately go down because just the numbers of Indians that are there. You know, put into context that sent, Indian population at the time, say from 1200 AD onwards, was about 15 to 20 times that of the Central Asian population and elsewhere. The Indian population was always high. So just the numbers that of slaves that were yielded from one or two conquests was so high because of the population itself. And as I said, once they killed off the armed men, it was quite easy to subjugate all the women and children and older men and just tie them up and transport them. During Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb's reign, destitute peasants and their women were carried away by tax collectors. This we know. Um, so during Tughlaq's reign, Batata found an excess of slave markets in slaves in the markets of Delhi, making them very cheap, and slaves were sold at a low price. Okay, yeah, we covered this. So obviously, attractive young women sold for higher prices. Skilled laborers sold for higher prices. Domestic slaves sold for very low prices. So as I said, they had to fix the prices to regulate markets. Khilji fixed the price of a good-looking young girl at about 20 to 40 tankas, and the price of a male slave at 100 to 200. Handsome young boys were sold for 20 to 40, and others that were less fit for labor for 7 to 8. And we have no way of knowing what's the value of this currency, but but it's human trafficking at the end of the day. So any price is too low. So yeah, so the treatment of slaves and converts. Um, so 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 Muslim teachings of equality remained a dead letter for a long time and never realized in the consciousness of Arabs, who roundly denied it in their day-to-day behavior. So basically the Islamic claim of egalitarianism, we don't see it anywhere, especially in the treatment of low-caste Muslims. In fact, James Wise, he was a civil surgeon in Dhaka. He witnessed low-caste converts to Islam not being allowed into mosques or even graveyards. So from a social point of view, from a societal point of view rather, they were still kept in the fringes of society. There was not much benefit to converting, and as in they didn't automatically um, become respected in the foreign Muslims' eyes just because they converted. So Kanwar Ashraf noted that with the conversion to Islam, the average Muslim did not change his old environment, which was deeply influenced by caste distinction and general social exclusion. So if there was any, yeah, I covered it actually. That's enough. Yeah. So just now I'm going to get into all the avenues in which slaves were employed. So the major industry was building and construction, and all the medieval Islamic architecture you see was slave labor, especially Hindu slaves who were captured specifically for that purpose. And looking at medieval Islamic architecture in India, the Central Asian Islamic empires, they imported huge numbers of skilled artisans and skilled labor from India. So just to go over uh, the rulers and what they did in India. So yeah, throughout Islamic rule, Muslim leaders of India built mosques, monuments, mausoleums, citadels, palace cities, and repaired them. All of this was done using slave labor. Historians glorify Islamic architectural monuments as the greatest Muslim achievement in India. So like even Nehru keeps saying, they gave us beautiful Islamic architecture, and he completely discounts the fact that all of this was horrifically. Someone says whenever there was a building coming up, it was always supervised by Muslim masters with their whips. So that's the imagery that we have to get when we look at Islamic architecture, especially in Delhi. Delhi's entire Delhi architecture is just completely slave labor. The sultans were famous for it. So yeah, Aibak and Iltutmish embarked on massive construction projects requiring large number of slaves, mosques, madrasas. I covered it in the case of Tughlaq. They would often build entire cities using slave labor, and if they fell short of slave labor, they'd send their generals out to collect more. So it was always the case that they use slave labor in their massive construction projects. So Batata wrote that it's their custom that king's palace is deserted on his death and the successor builds a new palace for himself. This happened with all the sultans. So and what happened was most often temples were converted into mosques and citadels and tombs or whatever. So this so the slaves would dismantle standing temples very carefully, stone by stone, carry the carved columns and pillars to the new sites, and raise new structures. And just like in the Qutub Minar, which I'll talk about next after this, huge complexes of temples were converted into mosques using the same building material, and they would often deface all the carvings and repurpose the material. So like the Red Fort, Hindus were enslaved in large numbers, and were engaged in cleaning up dirt and constructing new cities whenever. So basically in the medieval era, cities would become dirty. There was no modern sewage system, so they would become dirty very quickly, and a new city would be needed to be constructed. So they would order all their slaves to clean up the old cities and build new settlements further away. And that's how Delhi expanded to such a huge city. So every time a new sultan ascended the throne, which happened frequently in the Sultanate, they would construct a new city and to leave a legacy of their own. For instance, abandoning Iltutmish's old city, Balban built the famous Red Fort. Batata testifies that it's the custom that success. Okay, covered this. So yeah, he noted that Delhi was the largest city in the entire Muslim Orient, made up of 4 contiguous cities built by 4 different sultans. So yeah, as I mentioned, the Qutub Minar, I'm using this just as an example to highlight the manner in which slave labor and skilled labor was used to undertake massive construction projects. So Aibak started this construction in 1192, which was much before he established Islamic rule in India. The mosque was formerly occupied by an idol temple converted into a mosque. So they would, as I said, deface all the Hindu icons, and they would repurpose the pillars and building material to build these thing. And this is a picture of the Hindu pillars inside the Qutub Minar complex, actually. So Hindu slave labor was invariably employed on a grand scale for construction, and to undermine and degrade the achievements of the infidels further, materials from destroyed temples would be used in the construction of Islamic structures. The undertaking of huge ventures in India ahead of establishing the firm foothold for Islam affirms that the declaration of the might and glory of Islam was an urgent and focal mission of the conquest. So, as we see in Aibak's case, he started the construction of the Qutub Minar quite early. So yeah, these are more Hindu pillars. These are some Hindu carvings on the inside of the Qutub Minar complex. Another example, which exhibits how many slaves they had in their employ, is the Adaidin Ka Jhopra, which is it's in Ajmer, and it was a group of 3 or 4 temples. And when Gauri defeated Prithviraj Chauhan, he passed through Ajmer, and he came across this temple complex, and he said, "I want this converted into a mosque in 60 hours." And he told his slave general Aibak, and Aibak took 80,000, 70,000, how many even slave men they had, and he converted the entire thing into a mosque in 60 hours. Can you imagine how many men it took? So yeah, even in Central Asia, just as in India, the demand for skilled labor was high. For example, when Timur ransacked Delhi in the 14th century, he took about 100,000 captives, including several thousand skilled artisans, and they were enslaved and taken to Central Asia. And he used them for the construction of his famous Bibi Khanum Mosque in Samarkand. So you can imagine how they would use Indian slaves in, even if you take Marrakesh. Marrakesh all its medieval Islamic architecture, it was all built on slave labor, and most of them, not most, but quite a huge chunk of them must have been Hindus, because at the time they were the only ones skilled in construction and art and workmanship to be able to construct such magnificent structures. So yeah, another aspect in which slaves were employed by both the sultans, Mughals, everyone, were factories, or the royal factories or workhouses, and they would produce goods of every kind, like gold and silver articles, metalwork, textiles, perfumes, armory, weapons, leather goods, clothing, saddles, covers for elephants. So all of this was slave labor. In royal palaces and courts, they were employed in large numbers. They acted as spies. They were employed in the revenue and postal departments, musicians. And there's an account of Tughlaq's slaves. He had about 1,200 physicians, 10,000 falconers, 3,000 dealers in articles required for hawking, just to accompany him while hunting, 1,200 musicians, 1,000 slave musicians, 1,000 poets, 2,500 oxen, 2,000 sheep, and other animals were slaughtered daily for the supplies of the royal kitchen. So you can just imagine the scale at which slave labor was employed to run their, grand lifestyles. So sex slavery and concubinage. The special interest of Muslims in sex slavery was universal and widespread, and there's a lot of evidence to attest to this in Persian chronicles. In fact, Muslim chroniclers derived extra delight in narrating anecdotes of the subjugation of women and the indulgence of Muslims in sexual activities. So, as Muslim sultans started indulging in a life of debauchery, they created huge harems by accumulating concubines in the thousands, plus numerous gilmans. And I'll get into gilmans later. They're just emasculated young boys. Demand for beautiful girls and beardless boys made them a scarce commodity, and their prices rose to about 500 tankas and sometimes even 1 to 2,000 tankas. In spite of the low prices of slaves, young Indian girls were especially valuable, and people would pay up to 2,000 tankas for them. In the heyday of Islam, court officials, nobles, high-ranking generals, governors had dozens to hundreds, even thousands of slaves. Even poor Muslim households and shopkeepers often had many slaves, including domestic and sex slaves. The Hidayah states that the object of owning female slaves, as I said earlier, is cohabitation and generation of children. So it's in contrast with what the Arthashastra says. If you get a Muslim woman pregnant, the child and the woman are free. So, sorry, if you get a slave pregnant, I'm sorry. But this is in like contrast to the Islamic way, which was that the more children your slave woman had, all of them would contribute to your collection of slaves. So and obviously the Mughals were especially known for their huge harems. In fact, Jahangir is said to have had 300 slave girls in his ever expanding harem, even in his 20s. So you can imagine by the end of it how many thousands of women he had. Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan had about 5,000 to 6,000 wives and concubines in their harems. And each of them had many slaves to care for them. So each of them would have attendants who were also women slaves. And each of them would have eunuchs in their guard, to stand guard. So, just huge number of sex slaves. So this kind of an important subject, because it's very unknown, or rather it's not talked about much. So basically, this is one of the most cruel and dehumanizing aspects of Islamic institution of slavery. They would Eunuchs were always in high demand, because eunuchs were used to guard the harems, um, because they were emasculated. They were more likely to show loyalty for their master, and also if they couldn't have a family of their own, they were more likely to want to please the master in order to be respected when he's older. So, and also, they couldn't have virile men guarding harems, obviously. So eunuchs were employed basically for that. And the two major races that contributed to eunuchs both in India and abroad were Indians and Africans. So they were often castrated, and the especially knowing the Africans were known to be extra virile, so they would always, more often than not, men slaves would always be castrated. So, so yeah, I just cover in this slide where they were employed. They were employed as guards in charge of harems and in the households of rulers and high officials. They're employed as head of households, nobility, trusted loyal slaves, palace staff, custodians of mosques, tombs, and other sacred places. And they were objects of homosexual infatuation of many of the Muslim rulers, generals, and nobles. So Khilji is said to have had 50,000 young boys in his personal services. Many, if not all, were castrated. Tughlaq had about 20,000. And then when Aurangzeb sieged Golconda, he is said to have emasculated about 22,000 men. So the major source of eunuchs in India was Bengal and Awadh to some extent, but Bengal mainly, Bengal, Malabar. Another thing I forgot to mention earlier was slaves were mainly traded by Muslim merchants. Very few, if not none, were Hindu. In fact, I think K.S. Lal writes in his book that the Gujaratis were successful traders, but you would never find them engaging in slave trade of Hindus. It was just unthinkable for them, against dharma, and it was very rare to have Hindu traders trading in slaves. So that's just something to keep in mind, that the entire slave trade employed Muslim traders and made them very rich. Yeah, so Muslim merchants would purchase heathen boys either directly from parents or from kidnappers that already castrated them. If they weren't already castrated, they would arrange for the operation by specialist surgeons. And in India, it was generally done by the Hindus of the Vaidya caste. So Islam has Islam is against mutilation of the body, which is quite hypocritical because they would cut off the hands and legs of slaves if they were caught stealing and all of that. So, but in this case, they would not perform the castrations. They would employ in India it was the Vaidyas, but in Egypt it was some other group. So like that, wherever there was a market of eunuchs, non-Muslims were employed in the surgical process. The demand for eunuchs in Nawabi, Bengal and Awadh remained unabated from Khilji's conquest, Bhaktiar Khilji's conquest in the 13th century up until as late as the mid 19th century, despite the disintegration of the Mughal Empire and the disruption of long established trade patterns. So, they young boys were often purchased cheap from Bengal, and Indian and other merchants carried them for sale throughout the world because eunuchs fetched a higher price than normal than labor, men for domestic labor and all of that. Eunuchs fetched a high price because not only were they a costly commodity to create, the mortality rate was extremely high because obviously they didn't use the best surgical techniques, and castration often involved a penectomy. The mortality rate was extremely high. Some accounts say about 1/4 of them died in the process of castration. So whoever survived, generally the traders would invest in the eunuch. They would teach them, they would educate them and even train them in arms and all of that to make them to make them fetch higher and higher prices. So eunuchs were not sold generally at the markets in Delhi because they were sold directly to courts or transported abroad for sale elsewhere. Indian eunuchs were found in the Ghaznavid court, in the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, and Indians were one of the main races that supplied eunuchs. Persia seems to have received eunuchs from Malabar through a overseas route. So I covered this, but yeah, Bengal was a major center. And just to go over a few more details about Bengal, The Barbossa's account was that the Moorish merchants of Bengal would travel up the country to buy heathen boys directly from the parents or from persons who steal them and castrated them, so they were left quite flat. Many die from this, and those who live, they train well and sell them. They value them as guardians of women and estates, and for other low objects. They hold eunuchs in high esteem. Many of them even became quite rich and powerful men, as we'll see later. So the Aini Akbari, which is Chronicles of Akbar, it describes three categories of eunuchs from Bengal. Um, there's a typo here; it's Sandali, as in sandal, Badami, and Kajuri. In the case of first category, the entire genitals were removed. In the second, the part of the penis was left functioning, and in the third, testicles were either crushed or cut off. So, and there was probably a relationship between the procedure they were subject to and the race. So African men were subject to a certain thing, and Indian men something else. The very few of them were inborn intersex. So yeah, even in Java they describe the production and sale of eunuchs. Yeah, so eunuchs obviously, going into the colonial era, they were demonized as a criminal tribe, and they came under the Criminal Tribes Act of I don't know the year, but the British legislation, and they tried to drive them out of the cities, drive them out from their social standing, and many of them survived, but they were pushed to the fringes of society. I'm not going to get into the colonial policy and what they did to eunuchs, but just to touch on it just for a second. So Gilman, as I mentioned earlier, were castrated young boys. They were mainly for as sexual objects. They would often wear rich and attractive uniforms, beautified and perfumed, and they were in high demand because of the homosexual infatuation of many of the Muslim rulers, generals, and nobles. And whenever these young boys would grow a little bit, uh, they would get another young boy because they want only the beardless young men for their exploits. And the Quran attests to this. I don't need to go over that. And Persian poets obviously like glorify these Gilmans and express their perverted passions and compose lyrics to beardless young men. So yeah, slaves in the military, basically initially the military only had foreign slaves, and Indian slaves weren't allowed to enter the ranks. They were only employed as lowly foot soldiers. In fact, even Akbar's court was predominantly foreign. His minister recorded that nearly 70% of the royal appointments by Akbar were slaves of foreign origin. So the rulers would directly purchase foreign slaves from markets abroad from traders. Although you couldn't find them in the market, they were purchased directly. That's what I meant. The sultans also had an army mainly of foreign slaves. When Aibak became the Aibak was obviously a slave initially, slave general of Ghori, and when he became the sultan, he changed the policies a little bit. So when the Khilji dynasty came to power, Hindus who were enslaved and forcibly converted to Islam started appearing in the army, much to the annoyance of the Orthodox Muslims who detested the inclusion of lowly Indians in the armed forces. So, but the Khilji dynasty had quite a few looming threats from external threats to their sovereignty. So they were forced to employ local converted Muslims in their armies. And when there were Indian slaves in Muslim armies, as I said, they were foot soldiers. They were slim pickings, as they say, and like this Portuguese official describes, he said that they carry swords and daggers, and they were fixed at the lower ranks, such as the infantry. And if when they went on a military campaign, they would clear jungles and prepare roads for the army, and they were basically the lowest of the low within the Muslim armies. So Malik Kafur was a famous, quite a famous, successful general of Khilji, and he went on many campaigns in South India, captured thousands, tens of thousands of slaves. And he was actually a Maratha Hindu who was described as very beautiful, who was converted into a eunuch, and he was quite the object of affection for Khilji, who actually put him in charge after he died. So the decline coincided with the decline and decentralization of the Mughal army. The supply of Indian slaves to Central Asia dwindled in the 18th century as their military expansion came to an end. And this is also compounded by the general exclusion of slaves from tax revenue systems of successor states like the British, and the cultural separation of India from its neighbors. Okay, that's not that relevant. The combination of these factors resulted in a general decline in the exportation of Indians to the Central Asian markets, and this left Central Asian markets little recourse but to look elsewhere. So they started pulling quite large numbers of slaves from neighboring Iraq and Iraq mostly. So Shivaji also outlawed. I think today is the anniversary of his coronation. I think 347 years ago, so June 6th. So he was one of the first to oppose the Islamic policy of mass enslavement, the institution of slavery. He outlawed slavery uh, in his dominion, um, and even Sambhaji said that the English shall buy none of my people belonging to my dominions to make them slaves or Christians. So the Marathas were in general extremely found it an abhorrent practice and were extremely opposed to slavery, and that also contributed to the decline, we could say. So the impact of slavery, the major impact would be obviously conversion, killing, enslavement, and we could say that the castration, export, and killing of Hindus throughout the Muslim rule probably contributed to the decrease in India's population observed from about 200 million in 1000 CE to 170 million in 1500 CE. This is a huge number. So, and also the thousands and millions of Indian slaves that were sold in Central Asian markets, they obviously affected Central Asian society and they became part of that society, whether they were eventually emancipated or whatever happened. They became part of that ethnic landscape. So, just a number of Indians abroad who used to be slaves, in fact, in, uh, in his description of Bukhara, Alexander Burns repeated the popular adage that three-fourths of the people of Bukhara are of slave extraction, meaning that catch a random person on the road, like they're mostly of slave origin. So it's crazy the number of Indians that are taken abroad. But if you think about Africans, even though they bought and traded quite a few Africans, they were generally castrated, so they didn't leave progeny behind, so they don't contribute much to the diaspora. But Indians do. They sort of blended into the ethnic landscape. A large number of not castrated domestic slave labor was taken there. So yeah, so Johar was first reported. This is one of the impacts of slavery. So Johar was first reported following an Islamic invasion. So the first known instance was when Qasim captured Sindh. He's said to have kidnapped and enslaved the women folk, but the women in the palace set themselves on fire to it to avoid capture and sexual violation. This practice was largely unknown in pre-Islamic India, so we could say that uh, you know Islamic the Islamic practice of defiling women following the defeat was forced their hand. The trend continued even into the reign of Akbar. So, in his conquest of Chittor, he ordered the massacre of about 30,000 surrendered Hindu peasants for supporting Rajput princes. And when 8,000 Rajput soldiers were slain, their women, about 8,000 in number, who were ordered to be enslaved. They embraced death by jumping into the fire to avoid dishonor and sexual slavery. And actually, Chittor witnessed three major um, occurrences of Johar. So during Khilji's conquest, Bahadur Shah, and Akbar. So another factor is that it worsened sati. Since widow remarriage was not allowed in Hinduism, if there was a young widow, she generally, it wasn't compulsory, but she generally would, not only did were widows kind of outcasts in society, so it wasn't the life they wanted, but to avoid kidnapping and conversion and sexual assault, they would often kill themselves by embracing sati. So especially if young, they were particularly targets for enslavement by the Muslims. And if you take Malabar, the Mopla Muslims were a rather small minority, but they would still kidnap Hindu women. And even in the 18th century, they would sell them to European traders. And we see this even now in Pakistan and Bangladesh, where young women are targets of sexual slavery, conversion, kidnapping. So um, it's a huge factor in even in child marriage, because young women want to be protected from the Islamic. Okay, I'll get into that later, but right now, yeah. So the caste system worsening. This is what I alluded to earlier. I was trying to say that whenever there was a siege of a certain region, they would sink or swim together. The Hindus would generally sink or swim together, and they would, if they couldn't stage a proper fight to oust them, they would often run into the jungles together. So they would try to make a living or like just subsist on fruits and nuts and animals inside the jungle. And these jungle dwellers became outcasts in Hindu society. So they became the new untouchables, or they added to the population of low caste rather. And the main reason for this was, eating meat, probably, because once they ate meat, very few upper castes would accept them back into their fold. So, in some, Muslims probably took away quite a chunk of Indian outcasts into the Islamic fold, but kept them socially where they were earlier. And they also worsened the institution by making it more rigid, as well as pushing a large number of Hindus down the social ladder. So they would not only would they try and escape from various conquests, death, enslavement, they would they would they also lived and waged revolts together. So there were quite a few of these groups that would spend their life in the fringes of society just to escape enslavement. And this adds to this goes into the creation of Thuggy, which the British thought was a caste actually, but they weren't. They were just thugs. Like as I said, they were forced to go into the jungle, so they made their living. They made their living robbing caravans that passed by, and they turned themselves into a band of robbers. So again, I mentioned the Criminal Tribes Act. This is one of the quote unquote tribes that were included in that, and the British tried to outlaw them. And this was unknown prior to Islamic invasions. Of course, there were robbers and thieves, but not in these numbers and not this organized. And they sort of organized themselves as a cult later, and they believed in goddess Bhavani, like. So they sort of organized themselves, and this was unknown in pre-Islamic India. So, for instance, Hayan Sang traveled to Nalanda and said, in money matters, they are without craft, they're considerate, they're not deceitful or treacherous. So it's quite alarming to see the number of thugs that existed who were highway robbers in India. And, this is a huge subject. I won't get into this here, but it's, and as I said, whenever there was a rebellion or like a organized conquest, they would often force many of the able-bodied men into these sort of things because they couldn't survive otherwise. This is basically kind of unrelated, but I find it interesting. So this is the skull of Ganga Bishun. He was a thug who the British designated as a thug actually, and his skull is one of the seven of a few hundred skulls in the Edinburgh Phrenological Society. And this was back when the British thought phrenology was an actual science, but we know now that it's pseudoscience. But they were trying to figure out if there's a connection between the measurements, the ethnography of the skulls of these thugs and between other Indians. And obviously, first of all, obviously that's BS. First of all, the thugs weren't all the same caste. For example, this Ganga Bishun and one of the other skulls they have were both Brahmins. So a large number of castes and made up the thugs because they were all obviously forced into it. And when the British came around, they were all hung mercilessly. For example, this Ganga Bishun, he was retired for some 8 years, and some British official came to his village and asked someone, "Is this guy a thug?" And he said, "Yeah." So he was just taken and hanged. So that's the way the British did it, but I won't get into it here. Yeah, so as I said, just as Sati and Johar were Islamic creations, I mean, Sati may not have been, but Sati definitely increased. Just like that, the prevalence of child marriage definitely increased because not only did they want to protect their young women from Islamic invaders by marrying them early, they were betrothed at a young age so that they would be somewhat protected from, kidnap and enslavement and, sexual defilement. So even today, there's a reality for Hindu minorities in Bangladesh and Pakistan where there are high rates of kidnapping and rape of Hindu women. So we do see in societies where girls are abducted that they do marry their girls early. So it's a big factor in safety. Is a big factor. Was a big factor in the prevalence of child marriage. And that's it. I think I forgot to add a few references. I'll add them. I'll share them with you guys later. But yeah, that's the end.
I just wanted to add a couple of observations, having lived in the Middle East before when I was a child and having heard this from my parents. That, and it connects with what you said about the whole slave trade and the fact about how the Turks and the Arabs looked at the invaded, controlled populations, the dominated populations. They really looked down on them. So the Arabs actually still look down on Indian and Pakistani
Of course they do,
Muslims.
yeah.
It's a fact. And this was told to us by someone who was Arab, my father, when I was small, but I heard about this. He said, actually, Arabs look at Hindus with a sort of a grudging respect because they see them as people who were so dominant and controlled for such a long period of time, but who did not buckle under, whose ancestors did not buckle under that pressure and become Muslim. Whereas these Muslims are actually scorned the most, whether they do realize it when they're there.
That's absolutely true. Yeah. So yeah, that's true. And even right now in Indian society, we see the same racial distinctions that exist. The fair-skinned Muslims, the Ashrafs,
they have their castes,
are looked at as superior, and the dark-skinned Indian Muslims are racially inferior, and that holds good even within India and abroad. So Indian Muslims, the subcontinent's Muslims, are looked down upon by the Arab world. That's very true.
True. So coming back to, I always look for solutions and the way forward, generally in my questions. All this information, why don't you please write a book? Why don't you sort of get it out in a blog post, tweet it? People need to know. That's one thing.
That's true.
Secondly, another thing which I may add, and I'm glad you put that point of Johar. I don't know if many people know about this. This point about Johar, we all know about why Johar was done, but why were they burning themselves? I actually got to know only about 5 years ago. This I want to share with everybody.
It's because necrophilia.
Yeah. This was a very important point, and this is why I refuse to watch that movie Padmavat and all that, because they don't show the reality. I mean, why would a whole lot of thousands of women want to burn themselves? There are other ways of dying.
Yeah.
But because this was another way of subjugation and humiliation.
Yeah.
So
the defiling corpses was quite common by the conquering Muslim armies. So if the royal women wanted to save their, their honor, the only way they had was to burn themselves, and that's quite a dramatic and quite harrowing.
It is true, and it connects with what you have said about the whole what is endorsed in the religion.
Exactly.
What you have to do, to the infinite. So this is my observation. Thank you very much. I do hope you make a book out of this, or a capsule.
There are so many books about this, but I'll definitely share all of these.
We need this information out there, because this whole thing about Mughals having built India and rubbish, I mean, we've had enough of that.
Yeah.
I think,
I absolutely agree.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Best wishes. Yeah.
To congratulate you for giving excellent presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I will call a national shame perpetrated by the Muslims in India. But my question is that there is evidence that from 1 AD to about 1750 AD, India was the richest country in the world,
Right.
and our GDP was one fourth of the world,
Right. Yeah.
meaning hereby that the whole world's income, one fourth was in India.
Right.
Now, with that, how this slavery was prevalent, or was there so much of inequality in the society? And second part of the question is, you call them all slaves, but there are some laborers also, say, who constructed the Taj Mahal. They were all slaves, or are they were laborers?
Yeah, so some of them were, most of them were slave labor as far as we know, because as you know, especially in the case of the Taj Mahal, their arms were cut off so they wouldn't build something so grand ever again. So they might have entered into it with a certain payment and accepted a payment and maybe even accepted the terms of being dismembered after, but as far as I know, in all the medieval Islamic architecture, mostly slaves were employed. There must have been artisans of various sorts that were paid and employed. And the other question you had, you said, were there slaves in pre-Islamic India? I covered this in the beginning of the talk. Actually, yes, there were slaves, but they had human rights. You could not sell just randomly anyone and everyone you find. You cannot subjugate them. You cannot capture women for sex slavery in pre-Islamic India generally. So I wouldn't say that ancient India's wealth was built off of slave labor. I would not say that. Only very rich, like nobles and royals owned a few slaves in their for their employ in their courts and all that. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
So in the middle of the presentation, I don't know if you remember, but I mentioned the Kanhade, that book by Padmanabha. It had an account of Islamic slavery that happened in Gujarat. So there were scattered texts. Many of these texts are in unknown dialects. They haven't been translated. This text was discovered, I think, back in the uh, I think 50s or 60s or something, and it was translated by a scholar. So first of all, many texts are lost. Many are untranslated. Many are sitting in manuscript archives. There are definitely Hindu accounts of this sort of thing. We just haven't discovered enough of them to create a substantial case. And another thing is, you have to understand that Muslim chronicler. See, as I said again, Muslim chroniclers wrote about this in a sort of like they're bragging about it, and they're writing all these conquests to gain favor from the caliphate. They want to be more respected um, for establishing Islam in infidel territory. So they have a vested interest in recording these things so carefully in such a detailed manner.
Why we are having a great civilization, and we have great astras and main very vidyas like that, but why we can't resisted such people? They are coming in small quantity. They are crossing Hindu Kush mountains, and their numbers also decreasing due to
Yeah.
climate. Why can't we resisted?
So there was quite a lot of resistance. So in my talk, I didn't mention the instances of resistance from Hindus, but if you read Sandeep Balakrishna ji's book, he accounts, even as I said, Jayapala was captured.
Yes,
That was after he resisted the Ghazni's invasions quite strongly for his whole life. So there was quite a lot of resistance from Hindus, even local rebellions, certain castes that took up arms and waged war against even Mughal armies, and many of them were successful in winning their freedom, and many were subjugated and enslaved. So it's a matter of, maybe there wasn't a large scale organized resistance like in the Muslim armies, but in the Muslim conquerors case, but there were definitely smaller rebellions happening. There were definitely Hindu kings protecting their territories. And that's how pockets of North India remained unconquered by Muslims. So, in fact, if you take Egypt, after the Arab invasion, entirety of Egypt was Islamized. So quite quickly, like in the span of 100 or 200 years. So, and they had a huge, successful ancient pagan civilization. They had wealth. They had pharaohs. They had so. In other cases, in most other countries, it took them very little time to Islamize the entire region. In India, you could say that it was very difficult due to the resistance we offered. So, in my talk, I covered only the conquests, obviously. This is not to say that there wasn't resistance. You have to, I guess, talk about it another day because it's a huge whole other topic. And I was trying to focus on how people are enslaved. So, for that, obviously, I have to go to the successful conflicts, right? The conquests, right?
You said that Arthashastra says that a slave can buy his freedom from his master. So he wanted to know that what Ghulam, I don't know if the pronunciation is right. So he wanted to know
Ghulam.
what Ghulam has been called in the Arthashastra.
Okay, I didn't check because I didn't read the Sanskrit, but I can check and get back to you.
He's asking what is necrophilia.
Necrophilia is the sexual defilement of corpses. So, as the first person who asked the question, I'm not sure of her name, sorry. She mentioned why do they need to kill themselves so brutally by burning themselves? It's because they would defile the corpses after death, and there are even instances of necrophilia back in Muhammad's time. So it has a long association with necrophilia being, I don't know if it's allowed, but prevalent. So to avoid their corpses being sexually defiled, they would burn themselves. I think you mean to say that this information needs to be disseminated and we need to learn about it. And I think there is a way to do it quite well, because if you take US, they teach the transatlantic slave trade in their syllabus, and you can do it without riling up the white people against the black people and the black people against the white people. We don't we have They have a consciousness in their society of who was enslaved and who was not, and they have a consciousness of history, and they know their place, and they know who was the perpetrator, and they know everything, and it doesn't necessarily cause any further uh, you know conflicts in their society that already didn't exist. So there is a way to teach such subjects in a neutral manner, so that you put enough facts out there just to make people aware, and if they want they can read further. But yeah, you're right, this needs to be there. Delhi is glorified endlessly, Mughals are glorified endlessly. It's a big sham. It's not what we're supposed to be teaching.